Hello, Mr. Shamashish. It's nice to see you here.
Yeah. Hello. So nice to be here. Looking forward to the talk.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah.
So yeah, uh, Sandeep, I think it's live, right?
Just one minute.
Oh,
Let me
sure.
just. Can you check on the page?
Uh, yeah, it's saying Cobalt Blue is live, so I think it's it's live. Sandeep.
Right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So, shall we start?
Yeah,
Any-
Sandeep, you can start.
Are we waiting for more people to join
Sandeep, your
in?
voice is coming a little muffled. Um, I'll just start sharing the screen at least.
Okay, how
Yeah, this is better, Sandeep.
is the voice better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so just wait, Anupil. Let me share something before
Sure.
I give it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was asking, shall we wait for one more minute for more people to join, or shall we start?
We can wait for 1 minute. I think there will be some new people joining, and then
Okay,
we can.
let's wait for 1 minute. We'll
Um,
have some more people coming in. It's going on Facebook also now.
Perfect. Sandeep, you may just have to give me access for share screen. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give you.
So, guys, till the time we are waiting for a minute to other people to join in, I'm very curious to know where have you heard the flood myth? Like, I mean, even whether it's in the Noahs or whichever ones. So, like, I would just want to. I'm very curious. Did you like see it was in a movie, or did you actually read the book? Where did you read it, or where did you find about it? If you can trace it back to when you must have heard it.
Yeah. So I can say for my part that, yeah, of course, like I read it in the epic Mahabharat,
Mhm.
and many people hear it from the Bible, but then I also encountered it in the Mesopotamian myths. And then I realized that it's quite common.
So the Mesopotamian one, did you read it, or were you just like you found it somewhere in like some context?
No, I actually read in some, like it's more like academic papers discussing the flood
Got it.
myth.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Anyone else? Anything? How did you come across anything?
Yeah, for me, this is my mother. So
Oh, hello, Andy.
she used to read me world famous stories. So when I was small, so in that one of the stories was Noah's uh, flood myth. So that's how I know about it.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it's I think it's very fascinating that how many of us are aware of the Noah's Ark as much as we are aware of the Indian one. So speak something about the whole dynamics, right? So that's yeah. We'll talk about that more in detail. That's interesting. I see a couple of more people have joined in. I think we are good to begin. Um, Sandeep, we are good to begin. Maybe you can
Good to
just
begin. All
yeah.
right.
I'll just,
Okay.
I'll just share the
I
screen.
have the access. Wait, Anupriya, I'm sharing one screen.
Oh, okay. Just give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Stop. Yeah.
Okay, so all right, we got good 11 people now, so we'll do that.
And sir, it's interesting you said the Quran, but I'm pretty sure you heard it before you actually read the Quran also, right? In your childhood or something.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Usually, I mean, I went to a missionary school, so you hear missionary stuff. So the Puranas you read later when you want to discover your own self.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful session with Anupriya Kanti today on the deluge. Before we jump onto the session, I'm just going to quickly take you through about this program that we have right now. And okay, so this is called the India Unfolded Festival. This is International Festival of Mythology and Storytelling that we have been running starting from 12th of August, culminating this Sunday, 30th. And it's been a wonderful journey. We have had many programs under this with many speakers and many different stuff going on all across the month of August. We did these are some of our other programs also in Cobalt Blue Foundation. But we started with a virtual story walk through the mythological perspective through the city of Varanasi. We call it the city of liberation. And we went to the various ghats of Varanasi. Then our journey went to Pushkar, the city of the banned god. We told the story of Brahma through his various ghats and mythologies that's connected to that. We discovered Hampi. We also went to Khajuraho and understood the concept of four ashrams of life, Dharam, Arth, Kam, and Moksha through the various sculptures on the Khajuraho temples. And finally, we also recently went time traveling all the way to 8,000 years BC to Indus Valley civilization, and where we discussed about the fashion and the women and the lifestyle of Indus Valley civilization and the kind of unique characteristics of that civilization from the perspectives of storytelling, its architecture, and things like that. Coming up next now on 30th of August on Sunday, we have a workshop, 3-hour workshop on writing your own magical story, myths, legends, and fables. And that we will be having on 30th of August on Sunday. And post that, we have collaboration with Akshay Patra in United States of America, and we are in collaboration with that. We are doing a charity event where the tickets price will be contributed to Akshay Patra's cause of feeding the children. So that is another event that's coming up. And yes, so that's a little bit about India Unfolded Festival that we traveled through this entire month. And today we have the Great Deluge, and Anupriya Kanti will be taking us through various stories from the mythological and historic perspective of the catastrophes that we have experienced and how humans and gods dealt with it. So Anupriya, over to you. And for more programs, and if you guys want to stay connected, do check out our website and cobaltbluefoundation.com, and there you will see many more such programs which are listed on the website. So the stage is all yours, Anupriya. Take it up.
Thank you, Sandeep, for that lovely introduction. And yes, guys, check out Cobalt Blue. There is a lot of programs happening and many more coming in. I've really had a lot of fun, doing a couple of sessions, attending of some of them. So yeah, as I think Sandeep mentioned, this topic is about the catastrophe. I mean, when you think about the flood, you think of the catastrophe, and given the fact that we are living right now in a pandemic situation, it seems like the most appropriate thing to talk about right now. I'll just get started with the. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yeah. So, a little about the, what we're going to be talking about the session itself. I mean, the Great Deluge, obviously, we are going to be talking about the flood myths, and there are a lot of flood myths all across the world. That is something that I think we've now started realizing. But historically, because when cultures, while interacted, they weren't as well. I guess the globalization had not happened. The flood myths within a culture stayed relatively distinct. And I think what happened was, over time there were enough of these flood myths happening everywhere, and during colonization is when the Britishers, while doing a lot of the other things, they kind of figured out that every time they were encountering a new civilization, that they had a very similar flood myth. Now imagine what they must have felt, because given the fact that their story had come from the Bible, their first instinct was to find out that, oh my God, does this tell us that the story that happened in the Noah is not true, or something that is older than what the Bible prescribes? And I think that is what led to this sort of a great excavation. It was sort of a little bit of a fear, a little bit of curiosity. That kind of propelled this idea of wanting to understand other civilization, especially get interested in the mythologies itself. And this kind of led to this movement of comparative myth. Now, I want to be very clear about a few things, the terminologies and all. And I mean, this is again, obviously based on my interpretation and my reading. The word myth has also traveled through time. It's gone through a lot of evolution. The way we use myth right now is not the way the word myth was used. In a short sense, myth comes from the word mythos, which is the Greek word for speech. Greeks believe that there are two ways of understanding the world. The one way is the logos, which is through numbers, through things that can be measured, and things that can't be measured, which is the mythos. Okay, and all the stories that the Greeks had were called mythos. And by the time the word mythos came in English as mythology, which is study of mythos, this is around the 13th century. What ended up happening was that because there was a lot of movement between civilization and all, and at some point in time Europe was expanding, and Latin had become a common terminology, a common language itself. This became a space where, any civilizations, stories were considered to be its mythology. You have to understand from a Judeo-Christian term, Bible represented the truth. Everything else was stories, a collection of stories. Now, collection of stories by itself did not have the connotation of it being false or not. It was just a collection of stories. By the time we come to the Victorian age is when colonization started happening. And colonization itself led to a moment where people started coming up with, oh my God, this civilization also seems to have stories, and there are very common stories itself. And that kind of led to a moment of, wait, we need to call these things mythology. And given the fact that it was happening so often, and in so many civilizations, the Victorian notion of myth being a false story, or just being a story and not being the truth, was the place where it started coming from. Added to that, especially in India, we have a very similar word called mithya, and mithya in Sanskrit means something that is not measured, and then evolves in its own language towards being something that's not true. So by the time people were transcribing and translating it, these words did get commonized, and ultimately started being representative of the word myth in terms of something that is not true. And this obviously has led to a lot of issues with people, because ultimately a lot of the myths come from belief, right? And for a lot of people, that becomes a sort of an insult if you're calling something a myth. And it is fair. You have to be very careful and respectful of how people do see it, right? But having said that, people who are, especially this is the post modern age sort of a thing, people who are interested in mythology or mythologists, and people who are trying to study mythology, most of them don't come from a sense of trying to think of myth as false or historically accurate or completely untrue. I think it's more from an understanding perspective of these are cultural truths or transcendental truths that we need to understand the culture. So whenever I use the word mythology, or when I'm using, or I'm going to talk about mythology, I'm coming from that space. Okay, I am going to be talking from a little bit of an anthropological space. Having said that, I am not here to talk about whether a certain myth was true or not. But at the same time, from an anthropological perspective, we are going to talk about what could have led for certain myths to be having a common ground, what could have been the origin of certain stories that could have led to. Whether you want to believe in myths, whether you want to, see myths as a falsification or a departure from reality, is something up to you. But I do think that misses the point of mythology and the impact it can have on us. So having said that, when people are looking at these common, the stories across Norse mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, even in our Indian now, when I say, Indian mythology is too broad a term. In Indian, there are multiple mythologies. There's a Vedic mythology, there's Puranic mythology, there's, there are different mythologies. I mean, many cultures have mixed around. So calling something Indian mythology just becomes too broad a term, right? But over time, there were enough of these stories and trends that came out very common. Some of the things I have covered in my session of Mathematical over the series. If you haven't seen it, please go to the Cobalt Blue Foundation or my YouTube channel. There are a lot of the recordings here. And we've kind of covered some of these, the mythology, whether it's the theft of fire, the storm gods, the world parents, the idea of separation of earth and, earth and sky, the idea of killing a sibling. But one of the things that comes out very common is the flood myth. Now, if flood myth is almost like a gateway drug for any person who's interested in comparative mythology, because that's the first thing a person kind of notices. In fact, for most of us who started acknowledging that there's a very common mythologies, or we end up finding it very, very exciting when certain mythologies or some stories have some sort of a reference in another mythology. Flood myths are the most common ones. And that's the reason we're going to talk about the flood myths. So we'll begin with the story of the flood myths, and we'll begin with one of the older ones that have come in our purview. And this is a story of Utnapishtim coming from the Babylonian mythology. So Gilgamesh was a king, and he was very upset. Recently, his best friend, his only friend, Enkidu, had died. And that made him wonder about his own immortality, his own mortality. And he, in the search for immortality, he ended up going through a quest, going through a bigger journey, trying to find this person he knew as his ancestor called Utnapishtim. He had heard that Utnapishtim is an immortal being, and he wanted to find out what really made him immortal. So he trekked, and he finally came to Utnapishtim, and he asked him for his secret. Utnapishtim initially refused. He just was dismissive about telling him. But Utnapishtim's wife kind of told that, this a guest has come. Why don't you do so? Why don't you just give him the tale to tell him what has happened? And so Utnapishtim begins his tale, the story of the flood that had happened. So Utnapishtim tells about a time, long time ago, many thousands of years ago, the gods called the Anunnakis were having a discussion. They were really, really angry. The Anunnakis, out of which there was Enlil, he was one of the gods. He felt that the human population was just expanding too much, and they were just making too much noise. They just kept partying, they kept enjoying themselves, and this just made it problematic for Enlil to go to sleep. And something had to be done. So, consulting to the other Anunnakis, Enki, Ishtar, and Nana, he decided that we have to get rid of them, and they come up with the idea, let's just have a flood, and we will not tell the humans about it. Most of the gods do agree to this. But Enki, who's also a sort of a trickster god, decides to go to Utnapishtim, and through his house that was made up of reed, a reed wall, calls him out and tells him that Utnapishtim, you need to break down the house and build a boat. And this goes on to a lot of details about what kind of a boat you need to build, the dimensions of the boat, the dimensions of the boat of the width, height, and length have to be all similar, how many levels of the boat it has to have. He goes in a lot of detail. Utnapishtim, initially a little skeptic, hears him out. Enki tells him that there is going to be a flood and you need to do this as soon as possible and get as many living things as possible on this boat, and do it fast because this is going to happen soon. Utnapishtim initially is a little skeptic. He's like, how am I going to explain it to the town people? So he finally, along with Enki, comes up with this idea that he goes to the town people and tells them that Enlil, the god, is rejecting me, so I need to leave the city. And it's only if I leave the city, he will be raining down these sort of wealth on you. And if you notice, some of the terminologies he uses are all about showering or the idea of water metaphors. Basically, he ends up convincing the town people that if they help him build a boat and help him sail away, the town is going to flourish. And this is how he, Utnapishtim, gets the town people to be helping out in creating this enormous boat. And soon enough, the flood does happen. As soon as the flood happens, Utnapishtim, along with his family, along with his wife, and even some of the carpenters who were helping him out, and some of the animals, locks himself into this sort of a cube. And when the flood does come in, something changes in the gods. The gods, instead of enjoying the spectacle, since they caused it, are suddenly very frightened. There's a description that literally says that the gods were cowering like dogs, climbing the walls of the heaven. In fact, Ishtar is said to have shrieked like a woman in child labor, saying, "What have I done? Why did I listen to the assembly of gods? Why did I do this?" Literally regretting whatever the idea had come in. And this kind of this flood happens for almost 7 days, and at the 7th day, the water calms down. Utnapishtim, for 7 days and 7 nights, keeps waiting for the wind. What he does is he takes a bird and he decides to finally release it, just to see if the bird does, if the bird comes back, the land is not there. But if the bird doesn't come back, something, some sort of a land must be there. But while he's doing it, he literally looks around and he notices that all humans, everything has turned to clay. And he is really aghast, and he wonders what, was this flood really necessary? Finally, he decides to, he notices that the land is nearby because one of the birds does not come back, and they go onto this mountain. And the first thing he does is he takes some of the animals and he makes a sacrifice. While he makes a sacrifice, some of the gods do find this thing, and he makes an offering to the gods. But what's interesting is while he's making the sacrifice, he ends up telling Gilgamesh that when he made the sacrifice, the gods smelled the fragrance of the food, and they came around like flies during a sacrifice. So the way he describes the gods are almost like these animals who were attracted to something that was rotting. And he gives them the sacrifice too. Ishtar really feels bad for what has happened altogether. She literally apologizes from the gods that to Utnapishtim that this should not have been done. So she takes she kind of tells her, she takes a vow saying that this will never happen again. And she takes a vow on this lapis lazuli, which is a necklace that she used to wear. And it's interesting that this necklace is mentioned because lapis lazuli is an element, or is sort of a gem that was actually mined out in the Indus Valley civilization. This is a very common thing to be trading. So she actually takes this, and she uses this as the basis to take a vow of never having to do a flood again. Now, Enlil, when he comes and he's very angry, he sees that all the gods are standing together with this man, and when he sees Utnapishtim, he's furious. He's like, wait, how did that happen? I had made sure everyone was supposed to be dead. How is this human, this mortal, still alive? And Utnapishtim is a little scared, but Enki steps in, and Enlil is furious. He's like, how could this have happened? The only way this could have happened is if someone had leaked out the secret. And all the gods point out to Enki. Enki must have done it. Now Enki, very interestingly, instead of apologizing or this, he ends up going into this complete offense mode. He ends up telling, Enlil that, yes, Enlil, I need to, ask you something. How could you have done this flood without consideration? How could you have decided that humanity needed such a punishment? You need to make sure that the punishment fits the crime. So he says these lines that charge the violation to the violator, charge the offense to the offender. And he literally says this in front of Utnapishtim, that if you really had to do it, instead of doing a flood, you could have set out lions on them. You could have set out the wolves on these these humans. You could have set out a famine. You could have set out pestilence, diseases on them. Why did you have to do flood? Flood is just, you have killed almost everyone except for these two beings. And then on himself, when the question comes that, yes, I did not really talk to him, he says that I kind of just appeared on this person's dream. This thing, Atrahasis, is another version, a name of another character that is similar to Utnapishtim. So he just mentions this name that I came as a dream, and thus he must have heard the secret of the gods. So it's not my fault; it's your fault to have done this onto humans. And I think all the gods start blaming him. Enlil, this is this is something that you're taken too far. We should not have done this. So Enlil decides to go up to Utnapishtim, tells him that kneel, and he asks his wife also to kneel, and says that till now you were a human being, but since you have found a way to survive, and at the same time you've also ensured that humanity has survived, you shall live like gods, and thus you shall be immortal. And this is a story that ultimately Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh of how he was immortal. Now, there's a longer story to the story of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh ultimately, wants to know. This does not really help Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh was looking for how he can be an immortal. So ultimately, there's another story where Utnapishtim gives him a tip where he can find it, and Gilgamesh goes around for another adventure and all. And that's a tale for another time. But this is a tale that comes from the Mesopotamian region of Mesopotamian region. Now, when the flood myths were found, the earliest there were different versions. There are 3 versions that were actually found. The deluge tablet, there were tablets of 12, out of which the 11th tablet had the story of the flood myth, which had mentioned Utnapishtim and all. And this was around 1800 BC. But later on, after a lot of excavation, another older tablet of the Atrahasis flood myths, where the character of Atrahasis is mentioned to have gone through this journey of flood, was found, and this was almost around 2200 BCE, so almost 4,000 years old. And that's how old these stories are. So this is how the story of the Babylonian flood myths come to us. And Utnapishtim, while having progenited the human beings and all, gives us an understanding in the Babylonian mythology of how the world had completely got washed away and it came back. And the next time the gods decided to punish humans by just sending out wolves, sending out lions, or just putting out some bit of famine to just hurt the human beings enough and keep them in check. And that was the story of Utnapishtim. Any questions, anything, before I move on to the other story?
I actually had a question.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how he describes that you could have, launched famines or wolves or lions on them. How, what is the idea behind why is that better, than a flood?
So it is the flood kind of wiped out all the humanity. Putting out a lion and all, the idea was that if you want to hurt the human being, hurt some humans, don't hurt everyone. and that's how it comes. And the peculiarity of calling out lion, wolves, and then famine, I think it also is a way to understand how gods talk about things. I mean, for the gods, humans are ants. So it's the same thing, like, when we talk about pest control, like, okay, if the rat is there, don't kill the rat, trap them, or just, put out some sort of a rat poison that can, like, put them to sleep. And that's how they're talking about it. And it's a very interesting thing that they are doing this sort of a discussion in front of Utnapishtim. Yes, John?
I'm unclear about how many were destroyed. In the Noah story, of course, all of humanity except Noah. But what about this? You said that they were turned to clay. Does that mean most people were destroyed, or some, or all?
So the destruction itself has been described as humanity itself turning into clay, which is the way of destruction. I think the Mesopotamians literally believed that human beings were formed through clay when when the gods were playing around and kind of formed and gave birth to them. Enki was one of the persons, because he's the god, he's a trickster god. He's also the wind god. He kind of gave them breath. So when we talk about destruction, it's not the biblical destruction of people actually been killed as much as them being drowned and, like, disintegrating. It's almost like, we were made of clays, and when we were submerged in water, we just ended up being these soluble masses and then just, like, floated around. And finally, it's Utnapishtim who and his wife who kind of progenate the human beings altogether. So, yeah. So cool. We'll go into the next story. This story comes from the Puranic mythology. And just to give you a sort of a caveat, similar to the Babylonian mythology, this is another story that has many, many variations. Even in the Puranic, the Puranas itself, there are multiple variations, small changes in the story, but there are also enough gaps for people who are trying to tell the story to find a new way or add a new element to it. So I will just give you a sort of a retelling of the story of Manu. Now, King Satyavrat was near a river when ultimately, while he was praying, and suddenly a fish comes in, and fish comes to his arm, and he looks at the fish, and the fish says that, can you save me from this bigger fish who's trying to eat me? Satyavrat is a little confused. He first thinks about it, and he just says, yes, I can save you. And he ends up taking the fish out of the water, and he decides to carry it back home. Now, while it does this, it notices that the fish is going bigger and bigger, and it's not enough to be able to, he's not able to carry it in his palm. So he puts it in a sort of a bowl. The fish ends up being bigger and bigger, and within a few days, he comes and checks on the thing, and it's on a tank. The tank is already full. So he puts it in sort of a reservoir, and he comes and keeps checking on it, but he keeps noticing that the fish is going bigger and bigger. It's taking up food. It's also eating a lot, and but he had sworn to protect the fish, right? So I need to put it. So he decides to tell people to, to ultimately create a bigger sort of a bucket to ensure that the fish remains. But the fish becomes bigger and bigger. And at one point of time, this starts having a bit of a problem, because the fish is so big that it had to be thrown into the sea again, and the sea starts rising up. Satyavrat knows that something is wrong. He starts realizing that something has gone wrong, and he knows that this is not an ordinary fish. So he ends up praying to it, saying that, please tell me who you are. Why is this happening? Why is this, why are the water levels rising and all? And he's really scared of the calamity that's going to come in. The fish tells him that because you rescued me out of the waters, you took me out of the law of the jungle. You took me out in a place where I could have been eaten. And now you've chosen to protect me. But by protecting me, you ended up starving the fish that was going to eat me. So now I am growing bigger, and you have to feed me. But I'm going to grow so big that ultimately this is going to lead to a flood. You shouldn't have rescued me if you didn't want this flood. Satyavrat is a little taken aback. He literally says, please tell me, what can I do? So this is where the fish or Matsya tells him that there is one thing that you can do: build a boat and just ensure that all the Saptarishi, the seven rishis in the world who are supposed to be the guardians of the Vedas and all, are together and meet me at a particular place. And when the flood does come, you will I will rescue you. And saying this, he talks about, he gives a sort of a flash, and this is where Satyavrat realizes that this was no ordinary fish, but Vishnu himself. Vishnu, the one of the holy trinities in Hindu mythology, had come and showed him a way out of this flood that was going to come in. And soon enough, true to the word of the god, flood does come in, and his entire kingdom and the world starts getting destroyed. But luckily, the boat that had come in, the boat that had been built before time, the boat that had also been was built with the help of the Devtas and the other human beings that were also there before everyone got wiped out, was built, and Matsya comes back. And this time Matsya comes back. Matsya is so big that it actually has a horn on its forehead. And along the horn, there is a sort of a long rope. The rope looks very serpentine in nature, which Matsya tells Manu in Satyavrat to tie it to its boat, and he drags the boat along. While he's dragging, the oceans are completely flooding. World is literally getting submerged in water, but Matsya is able to navigate and pull through the boat and all. And finally, when the water level rises so much that Matsya itself starts growing alongside. And at one point in time, just to help the boat survive, it grows so big that it's able to lift the boat in one of its fins. And finally, at one point, it takes it to Mount Meru and leaves Satyavrat along with the people that were on the boat. Satyavrat is grateful and he thanks Matsya, Vishnu itself, for having come in and saved his life. Vishnu tells him that this may happen again, and you are now in charge for getting to ensure that humanity survives and all. Now, Satyavrat is a little confused. He asked one of the Satrishis, Bhrigu, why was he chosen for this, for saving the thing? And that is when Bhrigu tells him that you are, this is something that keeps happening again and again. And every time this happens, there is this one person who's selected who is finally the savior of mankind, who's considered Manu. So Satyavrat is like, oh, so am I Manu? Am I the first one? He's like, no, you are actually the seventh one. And you are in charge of ensuring the humanity survives for this time until Pralaya comes back again and restarts this altogether. So Satyavata, now called Manu, and in the long list of things, acknowledges that he was part of a longer scheme. He starts wondering that, one thing that does bother him is, did he rescue the fish on his own, or was this something that was already destined? But he never knows. He just believes that Vishnu knew the plan all along, and he just does what he considers his duty or karma. And that is how, along with his wife Shraddha, he gives birth to a daughter who ultimately, along with a lot of rishis and a few others, they do proliferate and ultimately make the human population. And this is how we come to our age. So this is a story of Manu, a slight different variation than very common variations that we always hear. And I mean, the story of the Matsya avatar and all has always had a slight variations in different texts and all. One of the reasons that also has been said in the text itself is that because it's when the Pralaya happens, that time there is so much destruction, there is so much of chaos, that to get back to get back to a sort of a normalcy, to get back to a stage where Satyug happens. In every age there is a slight different changes of events that do happen, and to document that has always been tougher, so which is the reason that there are a lot of discrepancy, and the different truths we hear of the variations are basically the different truths remnant of different yugs itself, different ages. So that was the story of Manu. Any questions on that, guys? So, yeah. Sure, go ahead.
Is Manu a better person or a changed person with each cycle of deluge?
So in the scriptures, there are the way it's denoted about him, the way that they talk about him. It's kind of given that the God was impressed, but there are times, and this is something that many of the Puranas are not extremely clear in all the scriptures. You have to understand there are 18 Purans. So each of the Purans have a different variations. What's common among them is that it's always clear that Manu was chosen, but the reason of why he was chosen is never explicitly given, not like the other mythologies, the one I'm going to be talking about soon, where at least there is some sort of a hint given. It's more like this man was chosen, and given the fact that Manu is more of a title. Manu is a title which comes from Man, the idea that in Hindu mythology, humans came from the mind of Brahma, so that's why Man, which is mind, and Manav, which is humans, come from the concept that anyone who's belonging to Manu itself. And given that, and since it's a title, there is no one characteristic. Each of the Manus have a very different characteristics among them, but each of them are responsible for saving and following the order of the boat and rescuing humanity itself. So yeah, that is the story. So we come to the the third story, one of the most famous ones. This is the story of Noah. And this comes from the biblical mythology. Compared to the other two, this actually has much, a very it has a singular source, so it's a lot easier to talk about it, to say what has happened and all. But given the fact that the story of Noah is also mentioned in the Quran, which is taken and he's mentioned as Nuh, there are slight variations in the in different texts and in different in different scriptures altogether. And that has to be taken into account because each of the scriptures had a different point they were trying to make with the story. We're going to talk about the biblical, the story of Noah itself. The story starts way back at the start after creation, when two humans were created by God, Adam and Eve. But things started going wrong when Eve decided to go to the Garden of Eden and eat from the tree of knowledge, the fruit itself out there. God had forbidden the two humans to do that, but Eve, kind of getting manipulated by a talking snake, decided to take a bite and makes Adam also have a bite. And because of this, God banishes them from the paradise itself. Adam and Eve are completely made aware of their own self. They made aware that they didn't have clothes, so they start covering themselves. They start feeling shame. They have to toil the earth to they start feeling hungry, so they have to to hunt animals or to have to ultimately eat from the ground and all. And this ends up leading them to have two kids, which is Cain and Abel. Previously I had spoken about the story of Cain and Abel, but in short, Cain and Abel were the two sires of Adam and Eve, in which Cain ultimately kills Abel out of jealousy, and then goes away. Before fearing God's judgment. It is Cain who literally who goes to city of Enoch and has a child and ultimately has his own descendants who keep committing a lot of crimes and a lot of things that the God wouldn't have approved of. And by each generation, it comes to a point where humanity is no longer closer to divinity. They're no longer pure and innocent, but they are getting morally corrupt every time. It starts with small things where men are teasing women, and they just start trying to get women and have their way with them. It goes into certain type of hedonistic activities where people are just drinking, and they start consuming a little bit of meat and all, which was not something that God had initially planned out. And then it goes to furthermore where new form of creatures are being created. There are creatures like the Nephilims, which in Hebrew basically means the fallen angels, or sort of mixed creations. They are sort of like giants, and these are sort of supernatural creatures that do come in. There's Gibborims also, who are these sort of race of giants who keep terrorizing people, getting their way. And it's almost like the city itself is plagued by a lot of crime, lot of problem elements and all. To the point that the God is literally fed up with the world itself. It is during this time, in the line of Cain and all, one of them, the 9th generation, Lamech, gives birth to this person called Noah. Now, a lot is not known about Noah's childhood and growth, sort of a thing. He's already, considerably older when he hears the voice of God. Noah is someone who's never, indulged in anything that God would have frowned upon. He was righteous from the beginning. So when he finally hears a God, God tells him a secret. He's going to destroy the world because the world is full of violence, and it's something that needs to go away. And he tells him to build an ark, a boat, and with very specific instruction of different materials and what kind of structure that has to be there. Tells him very clearly what he has to make. Noah starts doing that. He instructs his family. His family is helping him out. He even ensures that he himself is part of the creation. He's ensuring that the boat is getting made exactly how it had been required to do so. And then while he's making the boat, God tells him that along with this, you need to take 7 pairs of clean animals and a pair of unclean animals also, and 7 pairs of birds, so that they can populate the earth and all. Now this is very interesting, because generally what we always hear is the fact that Noah took 2 pairs of animals. He took 2 pairs of animals to make sure that the animals survived, but he took 7 pairs of clean animals because that is what he was going to be eating. And that's something that is missed out in many of the tellings of the Noahs itself. Now, the boat itself, when it was created, was fairly complex and had a lot of intricacies and structures itself. It was very elongated, unlike the Mesopotamian story where it was almost a cube which is floating around. This was sort of more boat-like in shape, but it had decks on top of it. And soon enough, this boat, when it was built, the flood did come in, and it came in such speed and such torrential terror that there wasn't enough time for a lot of other people to even grapple what was happening. Many of them drowned without knowing that they were drowning. But the boat, Noah, his family, and all the animals were there, and it was shut tight, and they were surviving. But the water, the turbulence that came in, the tsunamis, the flood that what it caused, rocked the ark a lot. Noah and all the animals were inside praying for this to stop. And this happened for almost 150 days. And this is when God remembered about Noah again, and also about the animals. And then the water started receding, and the ark finally came to the mountain of Ararat. That is where the ark finally came to rest. So it's very interesting that it's almost mentioned that the God remembered Noah and then decided to have that. It's almost like there was an action happening, and then he's like, oh wait, yeah, and that's where it's it goes around to stop the flood. Now, Noah is a little scared. I mean, he just, there was so much turbulence and finally it stopped and he doesn't know what is there. He doesn't know where the ark is stopped. So the first thing he looks out and he's just trying to find the land that he doesn't know whether it's land and also he just decides to test out a raven. He sends out the raven, but the raven ultimately, like having not found a place to perch, comes back again. Then he sends out a dove. He sends out a dove, same thing happens. Comes back again. The third time it does, it comes back with a fresh olive from its mouth, and this is when Noah knew that it had found some dry ground, and that's when they exit the boat. When they're exiting the boat, all the animals start moving away and all. That is when God speaks again, and he says this thing that never again, I promise you, I will curse the ground. I will never do this kind of a punishment, even if humanity's heart goes into an evil. And he blesses Noah, and he says that he tells his family that since now you are the sole human survivor, he literally tells them to be fruitful and increase in number. Basically, get more people on the planet itself, and the same thing for the animals. And to make a promise that he's never going to do this again, he makes a covenant. The covenant is the act of humans and God coming in together and staying together, and with the promise that God is going to come back again. And to give a sign of the covenant, he makes the rainbow, and that is why we have the rainbow as a promise that God had made to Noah of never again having to do a catastrophe or a disaster like this ever again. This is where the story of Noah actually ends from a flood point of view. Though in the Bible, Noah's story goes further, and like the Garden of Eden and all, Noah's family and all do fall into corruption and wickedness and all, which kind of creates the same cycle of problems and God having to intervene. And Bible ultimately is a series of how humans keep failing and all, and God keeps trying to figure out a way to come back. Ultimately, it comes to the point where Jesus finally comes into the picture, and being the son that was coming from the God, sacrifices himself for humanity for the sin that was committed by them. And that is a story by itself. But the flood myth, the flood itself, was the starting point where humanity had to get restarted all over again. And that is the story of the Noah's Ark. Do you have any questions before we move ahead to a few observations about this? I hope you are understanding and enjoying this. The stories are fairly common, so I was also trying to find out some more nuances which I think do not come out very easily. And the reason it's also interesting for me is that while it's obvious that there are common elements, it's also interesting how the stories are slightly different, which kind of changes the meaning of it. And that's the beauty of storytelling, right? Like a simple change of narrative, just not the characters itself, but the change of tonality, the pacing itself changes the story thing. And I think that is what the beauty of myth has always been. The idea of allowing variations, because each variation adds to the conversation rather than changing the conversation altogether. So those were the three myths. Now, I'll come to a few observations that have come through, and I'm pretty sure this is a question that must be going on in people's mind also. I mean, why are these myths having certain things in common? What has it got to do? To be honest, it's very hard for anyone to make a complete judgment on what must be true. There are different camps and theories. There are two bigger camps in general about the flood myths. Okay, and that's something that most of people either one camp belongs to the idea that these are all tellings of localized floods. These are floods that must have happened in certain regions, and people must have migrated and passed this story along, and that's why the story is common. The other camp believes that all this points out to a global catastrophic flood which must have come in, and they look at some of these geological timescales and seeing some of the evidences as a way to to prove that this is a sign of a global flood that has happened. Now, both camps have certain proofs, but nothing is conclusive right now, and there's always a debate going on, and there are always new ways of finding it out. There are a lot of groups, especially a lot of communities that are believing in their own mythology, whether it's the creationist groups or groups in Hinduism that believes that all these have historical truths to them. There are enough evidences to say that they are right, and there are many evidences to say that that's not true. And I think that's the beauty of life. It's too big to be seen by one perspective, and it kind of gives you all the options. So almost saying that you decide, right? So I think that's the thing that comes in. But having said that, I do want to point out what is interesting. If you look at the the global thing and the stories that come from, the flood myths come from various regions. Now, if you look at the region that the Gilgamesh thing comes from, which is basically the one that you have this beard person and all, it fairly makes sense that given that Noah's Ark and this Gilgamesh's story that had come out could have been influenced to each other, and that could have also had an impact on the Puranic stories. Just to tell you, by the way, from an archaeological evidence of the Puranic stories itself come around 500 CE. In BCE, there are evidences of stories which have the idea of drought and all from the Vedic stories, but the Puranic stories themselves, at least by the oldest record itself, go back to 500 CE, 100 CE and all. So in this aspect, the oldest story right now would be in these three would be the Babylonian stories, having being traced almost to 1800 BCE. Then would be the Puranic stories, and then would be the Noah's stories when the Bible was finally compiled and all. I'm not talking about the actual event, I'm talking about the recording of the event. And having said that, this is also something of point of contention, because archaeological evidence may not be matched to the mythical evidence of the stories themselves. Which one you want to believe in? That's up to you. But the fact that these stories come from different regions is very interesting. And what we look at it is that almost 12,000 years ago, when the Pleistocene epoch. Now I'm going to talk about the geological timescales. The whole Earth has almost 4.8 billion years of evolution history, and humans have just been around for last 300 years. Okay, this is based on the geological evidence and all. Okay. So humans have only been around for that long. Now, when I say humans, I don't mean hominids and all, our cousins that have completely disappeared, the ones that evolved from, that evolved from apes and the primates and all. But given the fact that there was there is a record in the geological time scale that there was a massive flood when the Holocene epoch, the epoch that we are in right now, that begins almost 12,000 years ago, there was a lot of ice that was melted, and because of that, the sea levels rose. And when the sea levels rose, lot of the coastal region that you see right now, the current map you're seeing, has an additional red part of it. The red part is what got submerged during this time. And it's very interesting that this part is what got submerged, because if you look at it, the entire Western India got submerged. The area of Italy, the Greek in that area got submerged itself. The entire eastern side got submerged. There's a whole flood that happened around France areas and all, almost giving you an idea that this these kind of movements and the flooding and the fact that people may have had to retreat may have been the inspiration of many of these stories that must have come through. And given the fact that people move from one area to another, they must have influenced and created a sort of a chain that can be traced back. As I mentioned, many of the stories have commonalities, and it has led us to believe that during the human migration that had come through, we can all trace back a lot of these stories to the Proto-Indo-European this region of of the world. Now this the mythologies of Proto-Indo-European are not proper mythologies. These are derived mythologies by scholars. They've literally traced back enough stories, and they said that okay, there must have been people who lived in lived in Central Asia, and they must have had a similar myth. So there must have been one myth about the flood myth. And that's why many people believe that the Black Sea and the Dead Sea, those must be the one that must have actually been flooded and caused people to disperse out and create the variations of the flood myth itself. So that was a little bit of the geological part of it, that the flood myths could have come from this. We don't know what could have happened. And I'm going to talk about the commonalities, and I'm pretty sure you must have seen this. Now, the word Laurentian, you must have heard of this term called Pangaea. Pangaea is basically this supercontinent that was formed almost more than 10,000 years ago, where our current continents are not actually how the world always was. India was part of Madagascar. It broke up and hit Asia, and that's why we have the Himalayas. So at one point of time, all these continents were all together, all cuddled up in a nice bundle, warming each other up and all. And it is during this time that the Pangaea had this section called Laurentia and Gondwana land. So there's a lot of belief amongst a lot of scholars that lot of the myths can be traced back to the Laurentian mythology. Now, Laurentian obviously comes before humans. So one of the things is that there must have been a flood that had effects until even humans arrived, and that must have been in our collective memories. And if you trace back all these stories and you come to it, you notice that there are certain things that are very common. Humans had kind of done something wrong. Divinity had to destroy it. There was a particular family that was preferred. Boat had to be built. Water was used to destroy it. Humans were saved. Animals were saved. There was a universal destruction. There was a land in the mountain. Birds were sent out. Finally, the surviving people worshipped it, and the god was actually favored for having done that. And if we use the Bible story as the common ground, we notice that every mythology across different civilization adheres to some of the components or not. And it's almost very interesting how much of commonalities have passed in through. Okay? So I just wanted to point out the commonalities. But what I'm actually more interested in pointing out is the actual differences between the thing. So let's look at the three, the major differences between the scriptures, the stories itself, and that comes out here. First of all, we use the criteria of what was pointing the existence of, why was a flood needed, what was the act of humanity being saved was considered, and what was the consequence of that. And what's interesting is, if you look at the Utnapishtim story, the Babylonian story, there's very clearly a mention of many gods. And remember, in the stories, the gods are talked about almost as these superpowered, out of their wits, complete. They don't seem to be in control of it. They don't seem to have a respectful quality. The way they have been described is almost like dogs and flies and sort of a thing. Compared to that, in the story of Manu, it's been very clear that there were multiple gods. There were devas and people, but there's also this one god along with the other two gods, the Vishnu who's there, and that's very clearly mentioned that there is a sort of a balance between there are many gods and there's also this supreme god kind of a thing. And in Noah, it's very very clear that there's just one god. So that's something that is very very clearly mentioned out. Now in the Utnapishtim story, the flooding happened because humanity was annoying. That was literally the reason that was given for flooding. While in the idea of flooding, it was almost mentioned that humanity is destined to have to go through this. This is a part of a cycle and this has to happen. And in the Bible story, the flooding had to happen because there was humanity is now evil. It is almost wicked. It requires a complete restart. We need to get out of this thing. It's rotten right now. And if you look at this, the idea of saving, so the act of saving was almost seen as a betrayal. When Enlil found out that humans are saved, he got angry and he felt that that was wrong. Humans are annoying. We were planning to kill them and you did something wrong. It was almost like the gods were having a sort of a dispute that why did you go behind my back, right? While in the story of Manu, the humanity being saved was an act of karma, that this always has to happen. This is predestined and this is always going to be a thing. Manu himself could have been someone in the previous life who could have done something right, and that's the reason he was destined. It's all beyond humanity's control, but the karmic debt is always being played. While in Noah, the idea of saving humanity came from this idea that, okay, humanity is evil, but let's save these couple of people. God completely forgot about Noah and then remembered and like, oh yeah, just wait, hold on 1 second, and he just takes the boat and puts it on the land, sort of a thing. What are the consequences of these actions? So if you look at the first one, the consequence is that Enki literally tells Enlil that if you had to do a thing, don't do a flood, just release like wolves, lions, and famine on them. And that's the thing that the gods decided that from now on we're just going to do this. So every time humanity misbehaves, we'll just slap them on the wrist by sending sending some plagues and all. So we know who to blame for the COVID-19 right now, the Anunnakis. And Manu himself, in the story, despite having made a mistake, or having done some sort of a thing that he feels is a mistake, gets to a point where like, oh, okay, I've gone against what was nature, and as soon as humanity comes in, there's a conflict between culture and nature. And Manu saving the fish was an act of culture, an act of empathy, which is not a concept of nature. So that created these kind of systems and all. And the only thing that had to happen is the god saved saved Manu and all as a collaboration, that you make the boat, I'll come back, you meet me in this destination, I will pull you along, and then everything is good. It was almost sort of a collaboration that, like, okay, everyone's got their duties, cool, let's just meet at a convenient point and let's follow, sort of a thing. If Manu had not followed, that would have been a lot of problem. But Manu did, and that's the reason it was something that, was almost like a collaboration. In the third part, the consequence was that the god had decided that, okay, I've saved you, human, and I want to promise that I want to form a covenant with you. I want to form a sort of a sanctuary where I can come to you, and here's a promise that I show you that there's going to be always a covenant, and I want to ensure that the covenant survives. Even if humanity goes bad and all, the covenant has to survive. And that was the story of Noah itself. And I think this is something that I find very interesting in all three stories. The concept of divine reaction, which is annoyance to, okay, this had to happen, like making a human feel it was something wrong, to God getting just frustrated, is very interesting with human resilience. In the first one, humans show resourcefulness. Utnapishtim is resourceful. He finds a way to ensure, trick his own town, tells him that, okay, hey, can you help me make the, can you help me make the boat and all? You will be rewarded. And uses their help, leverages sort of a thing, and then does that, almost like, some of our company, managers and all sort of a thing, makes you do a lot of things and ultimately save themselves. So we can always trace back some of these learnings and ideas that come through and all. In Manu's story, literally, he's a little scared, and at one point in time, he feels he's done something wrong. But when Vishnu reveals his form and he tells him that, okay, you must do this, and when Bhrigu tells him the story that you were meant to be another, like you were just another Manu in the line of Manus and all, there's a sort of a weird sense of conflict that Manu feels about free will and all. If you guys have seen Matrix, especially Matrix, second part, Neo literally goes through a similar sort of a thing where he finds out that he's not the only chosen one. There are multiple chosen ones. And I feel that when I saw the first time and saw this movie, I literally felt that the inspiration, especially the Matrix trilogy is amazing, and they've taken a lot of philosophical and ideas from and all. This is one of them. The idea of Manu figuring out that, this was all a part of a system and this was just a program and he was just a part of the cog in the machine sort of a thing. And what's interesting about Noah's story is that not once have you heard Noah speak during this entire time. All the conversation happens with God. Noah just follows like an obedient person. He's like, okay, I get it. Almost like he's actually happy to get rid of the, the evil human beings. And he's like, okay, God said this thing, I just must do it. He's just happy sort of a thing. He's scared during the time when the flooding happens. God is a little violent, literally rocking the boat. And then he's like, oh, okay, let me save you. And that's the time when Noah is saved. And he's just so glad that ultimately, he goes, follows the God's word sort of a thing. And the animals are saved and uses some animals to eat and some animals to, proliferate the, the earth itself. And I think this is where it comes from. The lesson here, I would always say, is that gods have always, toyed around with us, in the mythologies and all. And I think the lesson for us is that many of us spend a lot of time trying to wonder why this happened and all. But the best way of surviving is to either find a way to be resilient, like like Utnapishtim, understand that, there are things beyond our control and we can just do what we can do. Some actions are meant to happen. And like Noah also realized that, okay, fine, things have hit the fan. So might as well restart and just follow. If someone is giving you a window or like an opportunity, follow it. And I think especially in our current time right now, this becomes a very important thing. I mean, how many of us don't follow a protocol even when the current gods, especially the doctors, when they tell us to follow certain protocols and all, that's the time we need to be like Noah, and we need to understand that. When certain situations like the COVID and all happened, and it made us realize that the systems we have in place are not meant for this. The pandemic was something that was almost inevitable, the way systems function. So it becomes very important to navigate out of that, following the things. And at the same time, there are going to be times where the people in power are going to misuse these situations. They're going to use, the pandemic and all to make certain things. And that's the place we need to be resourceful, and we need to be smart to figure out. And if we are smart enough, they'll probably give us a seat at the table. If we can be kind in all three of them, if we can be kind to the people around us and not misuse them, there are certain things that we can get through. Manu was kind in trying to ensure the rishis are all fall. Noah also does an act of kindness, and gods were kind to us. So that is the story of the flood myths. I hope you enjoyed this. I do want to give a shout out to the illustrations and all. I took a lot of illustrations. I would love to actually have made them, but there was not enough time. And I've kind of realized that might as well, use what is beautifully out there. Don't reinvent the wheel. Not everything has to be restarted. We are not in a flood story ourselves. So I wanted to give a shout out. There are a lot of people who, whose work I did. Whenever I post this, video or in the comments, I'll put the actual name of the artwork. So if you want to follow and all, definitely do that. It was a very interesting and a fruitful journey for me to go back to the flood myths. I always feel like I know them, but then when I came back to them, I kind of felt like it was always something new to know. I keep laughing at the flood myths, especially whenever I read the Mesopotamian stories, and they have a humor quality to them. The Manu stories have some sort of a very philosophical quality to them, and the Noah stories have like a very sensational quality and sort of a thing. And I feel like it's very interesting when we look at all of them. So that was the flood myths, and thank you everyone. I hope is there any questions or anything, any comments or anything that you want to add to this?
Yeah, thanks. It was a great talk. I just had one comment. There's something which interested me very much about the similarities between the Indian version of the myth and the Mesopotamian version of the myth. That in the Indian version of the myth, you have the 7 sages. And they appear for the first time in the Mahabharata. They are not there in the Brahmana version. And in Mesopotamia also, you have the 7 sages.
7 gods actually, not the sages. It's a god sort of a thing. But yeah, you're right. The 7 is a very, very important number in many of the stories and all. In fact, in Noah's story, the idea of 7 pairs and all, it's like the word 7 must have transpired. If you look at it from a very anthropological sense, it's like, certain words transpired, and like some person decided to craft the story and put it in a certain way and all. That is given the fact that these stories didn't happen independently. Maybe all these stories actually happened. Each of the gods did a flood in a small region and then waited for humanity to react. And one day when the internet comes in, discuss it, laughing with us, So that was there. I do want to mention that there were a lot of myths I couldn't cover. I couldn't even decide that the reason I covered the 7 myths. I mean, there is a Greek story, the story when Zeus ultimately sends out the flood because one king fed him his own son. That was the story, literally. And Zeus was really appalled at that. He was like, humanity, okay, no, not doing this. Humanity needs a sort of a thing. And he would have killed all the humanity unless it was for his friend turned enemy called Prometheus, who stole the fire, and he told his son about the flood. So Prometheus did something that pissed off, Zeus. And Deucalion and his wife hid themselves in a box, and they kind of go into the flood. And then there's a whole story of how they come out and they repopulate the earth and all. There are stories in the Chinese version where there the flood is not caused by a divine interaction, but the king who literally tries to stop the flood, he's kind of blamed for trying to stop the flood. There's a story, like ultimately he's kind of blamed for trying to stop the flood, and he ultimately is not able to stop the flood, and the flood does happen and all. The Yellow River does go, sort of a thing. And story in the Norse mythology where one of the giant is actually killed, and when he's killed, because from his body all the earth and everything has to be formed, Odin kills this primordial giant, and out of his blood becomes the water. So what we are actually drinking is basically Ymir's blood. Next time you guys are gulping down, just remember that. And it's this blood that kind of floods it. And there's this one person called Belgermir who, with his wife on a log, survives, and they go into this place called Jotunheim, where the land of the giants remain, and that's the reason the giants have always had a problem with Odin and sort of a thing. Anyone who's seen Marvel stories must have also seen, like, the Jotunheims, this thing, and Loki is one of the Jotunheims because he's born by this thing. So many of the stories have influences from thing, and there are so many flood myths. I mean, there are Native American flood myths. There are flood myths from the Polynesian stories and all. I would have loved to cover them all, but there's so many. But definitely just do check them out online, and maybe someday I'll even do some of the lesser known flood myths. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, if there's any questions, anything, I'll be taking that up. It's we still have like 5-10 minutes. So
Pri, where did you get the like 4 slides back? You had a very extensive graph with 2 axes. One more.
Yeah, this one.
Where'd that come from?
This actually came from a couple of papers that I was looking at. So this one is actually, I forgot, I'll do mention the credits for the exact paper that I saw. But this one was trying to look at the flood myths across the entire Europe and Americas itself. They were taking Bible as the baseline of how much the biblical idea of these, the Genesis verses were mentioned, and which one were not mentioned partially and all.
Where can I acquire this besides the screenshot I just took? Where can I acquire this and cite it?
I'll do one thing in the Facebook sort of a thing. I'll put the links to wherever the papers and like the ones I found, and you can definitely do that. I'll definitely put out the papers, because I mean, as much as I would love to claim having made this right now, I didn't make that. Yeah, so that was one thing.
Thank you. I liked the graphics very much, the ones you made and the ones you used. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I see a couple of questions. I'm just going to read them out so we can do that. So one is with, Dhananjay sir, he's talked about mithya in Sanskrit is false as opposed to tathya, which is truth. So it is mithya and tathya. How do I pronounce these 2 words? You're right, Dhananjay sir, that this is actually the word in Sanskrit does come, and that the words, the meaning you've said. I think you are a better person to talk about the Sanskrit and all, since you are actually reading, and I'm looking forward for longer conversations on that. What I was just talking about is the fact that mithya in Sanskrit is not the exact influence of the mythical stories of the world. When we use mythology as a way to do that, they may have, during the colonial times, they may have been used as a way that, oh, okay, when we say myth, it means false, and in Sanskrit and Hindi sort of a thing, it became a common term to say something that is false. That kind of grounded the word to get distorted into meaning something that is not true. But historically, myth was never used as this thing. And I mean, if you look at it, the best way to look at it is fact, fiction, and myth. This thing, and I think this is something Devdutt Pattanaik does it really well. He talks about facts and objective reality is, everyone's truth, and subjective is no one's truth, sort of a thing, or there's nothing, sort of a nihilistic sort of a thing. Myth is someone's truth. So if enough people believe in it, maybe it's true. And that's the way I was going about it. So in your question, is there an underlying theme to this population control? Definitely. I do feel that, the gods have always felt the fact that, humans are going too much, and this has happened. If you look at many of our, Hollywood stories also where, humanity feels that it has gone unchecked. The latest movie of, Avengers, the one where Thanos' snap does that. He literally, the reason he wants to destroy he wants to wipe half the, planet, universe out of existence, because it's going too big, and he feels that he needs to do this. Humanity needs a sort of a recheck and all. So this is definitely coming from the myths, the idea that humanity is too much. And it's very interesting that during the time when the myths were written, humanity may not have been as populated. So where did this idea come from?
Hey, really quickly before you move on, I actually was thinking about Thanos' snap in the Avengers and stuff, and I'm glad you brought it up. So this idea, which I think you touched on in the first, the Babylonian myth, was of how people need the memory of how this happened, and then they need to learn from it and grow. And versus, I think, in like whether it's Manu's story or the biblical myth, I don't think that was there, where it was like a fresh start, except for and correct me if I'm wrong, except for the first man who was responsible to repopulate everything. Was this memory there? Because that was one of the biggest pet peeves that Thanos had, where he said that I can't really sanctify the earth because you have the memory, so this
He
time I'm
literally
going
says the fact that, Kate, as long as there are those who remember, there will never be those who get sort of a thing. I definitely think that, look, in the Babylonian myths, everything is a mistake, okay? Gods kind of overreacted and they just okay, wait, what happened? And Enlil just being very bratty, he was like, okay, wait, I told you to destroy them. Why didn't you destroy them? And I think gods convinced him that you shouldn't have done it. So they didn't come from a perspective that someone should remember it. Honestly, I think Enlil would have preferred if Utnapishtim was also not there, so that no one remembers the flood myth, the time the gods goofed up, okay? The Puranic stories go a little different, and that is where it does come in, where the idea of saving someone and all may have come from this idea that stories have to be saved. The fact that Saptarishis are always saved, right, does come in where the Vedas are eternal and sort of a thing. And this comes to a second point, I think, Cobalt Blue, Sandeep or Arjun have made, that Manu is a static point of creation. The evolution starts from him. He doesn't evolve himself. You're completely right. Like, this is why I told you this is the sort of a different retelling. In many stories, Manu is seen as this one figure. But in many of those, this is again an inference based on the fact that Manus are different. Same thing like Indra. Indra in many this thing is not, there's no one Indra. There's Indra is a title. Now in the Vedic stories, Indra becomes a person. But in the way, Puranic stories, the way the stories have been told, and there are enough stories to mention that there have been multiple Indra. Indra has always become a title. This could also have been a sort of a tug between the Vedic and the Puranic stories, because remember, Puranic stories literally take a lot from the Vedic stories. Vedic stories did not have a lot of concepts explored. The concept of dharma and this idea of reincarnation and all are just barely mentioned. They're not very, very important in the Vedas and all. They are there, but it's just not as explored. They're just there. It's in the Puranas these things become very, very important. And again, going from an anthropological point of view, remember most likely many of the stories of the Dashavatara and all have come backwards. The stories were written in hindsight. The first story, stories of Krishna, Ram and all were actually done before someone decided to make a compilation. In all the Puranas, the stories of the Dashavatars are different. Some say 5, some say 6, some say 39. There's not a very clear thing. The idea of popularization of Dashavatar, and by the way, this is just sort of a, I'm just going to leave it out there because it's a conversation another time, may have not come from the Vaishnavic tradition, the people who worship Vishnu. It actually came from the Shaivic tradition. I recently attended a lot of talks and there was someone who spoke about this, and it's a very fascinating thing that the Shaivic, Shaivism, the ones who worship Shiva, the god Shiva, were the ones, and Shiva also has a lot of avatars, were the one who kind of influenced the concept of the Dash avatars, which the Vaishnavis just took it up. They lapped it up because, it makes them look good, right? And that kind of so that's the reason there are a lot of inconsistencies in the stories of Manu and sort of a thing. I mean, come on, there's a story of Parshuram, one of the avatars of Vishnu, who meets Ram, who's another avatar of Vishnu. And you're like, wait, how does that happen? And then the stories justify that the day they met and they got into a sort of a fight, the divination just moved from one to another. And like, oh, okay, that's how they did it. And you kind of feel like many of these things are done in retrospect, okay? But, it shouldn't stop us from enjoying the mythical aspect of things, the mythical realities. So in that point of view, I would definitely say that, many of the stories do make Manu as like this one person, and he doesn't involve and sort of a thing. In many of the stories, Manu kind of was never rescuing, he never makes a mistake. He was literally told by the fish when he was saving that you must save me, I will save you from Pralaya and all, and this is destined, you are chosen. The version I was telling you, it didn't make it sound like, they kind of, the god was guilting him that, why did you do this? Now you have to go through this. So you never know, right? So yeah, I think that was the questions. Is there any other question, anything else? Okay, guys, thank you so much. I want to definitely give a shout out to Cobalt Blue, Sandeep and Ruchi. Thank you so much for this platform and this discussion we were having. And yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the creation sort of a thing. There are going to be a lot more stories coming out and all. I definitely hope I left you with something to think about. That was main intention. Even if it was the same stories told again, I do feel that we sometimes tend to go too much on the familiar narratives, the familiar stories. There are enough stories of the floods and sort of a thing, but not enough on some of the lesser known stories. There's a lot of focus on the Puranic stories, but not on like some of the tribal stories and all. And I definitely want to be working more towards that. But having said that, I think mythology is all about inclusiveness. One story being told doesn't mean that the other story should not be told. So yeah, just hopefully like this gives you guys something to think about, and hopefully the world doesn't get washed away anytime soon, and we come back into a world where the Anunnakis take away the curse. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
All right, Anupriya, thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sandeep, you want to say something?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to give just a vote of thanks to everyone, and thank you for joining our session today. And as Joseph Campbell said, that mythology is man's unconscious becoming conscious, and that's what all that this is all about. And wonderful session, Anupriya, and thank you for bringing such enlightening and illuminating stories and anecdotes from so many mythologies. Tremendous research done, and wonderful session. Thank you everyone for joining. Do write your feedback on our Facebook page, LinkedIn page, or send us to on our website or things like that. It's very encouraging for people who is putting so much effort for that as well. And this video is available on Facebook for later watch. If you guys want to see some point back again, and if you missed something, you can always do that. Share it with more people whom you think might enjoy this session. And do check out our upcoming sessions and workshops on our website, cobaltbluefoundation.com. And with that note, I think we should call this a night, and enjoy your dreams, the mythological dreams you might have tonight. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope everyone's had dinner. Let's have the food that was saved from the flood, and I'll see you guys soon. Okay.
All right. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye.